Sir Kannan Gopalakrishnan. He was working as a senior architect at Engineering Design Research Centre, L&T Construction, India's largest construction company. He's also worked on projects ranging from institutional buildings to international airports, apartment complexes to aircraft hangars. He's also attended 3 international conferences and 2 national conferences, and has also presented technical papers at the Jawaharlal Nehru University, Delhi, and the MSRIT, Bangalore. He's also won the national championship at Archaman at the India's largest architecture quiz. Sir Kannan Gopalakrishnan currently runs a design firm, Habitat Design Studio, and he is also a visiting faculty at the renowned architecture schools in Tamil Nadu.
Welcome back to UGC lecture series. This is AR 6502, History of Architecture and Culture 5. We are in Unit 1, looking at leading to a new architecture. This is lecture 2. In the lecture 1, if you will remember what we had the reasons of why we are studying history. We learnt them. We looked at beginning of modernity. We looked at the differences between modernity and modernism, and we looked at Age of Enlightenment, and we barely begun what neoclassicist architecture is. In this lecture, we will get deeper into neoclassicist architecture. We will be studying how it came from classicism and understanding its features. We will be studying about neoclassicist architecture and the Greek proponents in Britain, France and other places. So, let us get to the lecture. Before we study neoclassicist architecture, basically we need to understand the terminology. It is neoclassicist architecture. Neo means new in Latin. So, we need to understand what classicist architecture is. It's so something new architecture. So, we need to understand what classicist architecture is. Classicism in architecture developed during the Italian Renaissance. In the earlier period, notably in the writings and designs of Leon Battista Alberti and the works of Filippo Brunelleschi. I am sure you remember the lectures of History of Architecture and Culture 3, and in Renaissance architecture, I am sure you remember Filippo Brunelleschi and his famous Dome for Florence Cathedral, which marked the start of the Renaissance architecture. His works and some of the other people designs Leon Battista Alberti, and in that period classicism developed. It was simple revival, or let us say understanding of the famous Greek and Latin and Italian examples which were built in Athens, Rome and other cities. So, you take those examples, you study about them, and then you learn the concepts of how they built, why they built, the usage of materials, the usage of technology which they had, and most of the buildings that were built during the Renaissance age emulated these buildings, and these buildings were much bigger than the predecessors, but they pretty much had the same basic idea as that of the very classical architecture which Greeks and the Romans developed. So, this style of architecture where they emulated the classical architecture of Greek, Roman and similar time period buildings was called classicism. And classicism placed emphasis on symmetry, proportions, geometry, orderly arrangements of columns, pilasters, lintels, the regularity of parts. Symmetry, I do not have to explain symmetry. The similarity between one side of the building and the other side of the building, they have to be symmetrical, they have to be same, like a mirror image with a mirror in between. Proportioning systems are very important in classicism because that is the basic element of the element which holds all the classicist architecture together. Each and every element has a certain proportioning system. Doric column is certain meters high if the column is certain meters wide. So, that proportion cannot go wrong. If the columns are certain height and the number of columns on the pediment has to be certain in such distance. And some of the proportioning features, proportioning systems also comes from sacred geometry of the Greeks, where they take the golden rectangle and the concepts of nature, and then they try to get the proportioning systems into it. Next is geometry. The idea of equality and geometry is very important. You cannot have one column big and one column small. The distance between one column and different between another column cannot be different. It has to be orderly arranged. And then they had pilasters. Pilasters are nothing but columns which are attached to the walls, and even if there is a plain wall, you cannot leave a plain wall in classical architecture. You need to have columns jutting out of the walls, which will give us let us say a visual look of columns being placed on the wall, and it gives us the visual strength. They had lintels. Lintels means horizontal components which support on two columns, and they had regularity of parts, which means the elements kept repeating in good intervals. They had a regular rhythm or a meter in their architecture. It means the architecture is almost entirely predictable. They can always draw one part of the building if you see another part of the building. So, that is how regular the buildings were. Understanding classicism. As they are demonstrated in architecture of classical antiquity, and in particular the architecture of ancient Rome. The use of semicircular arches, hemispherical domes, niches and aerials, which are little buildings inside the buildings, is a common framing device in both classical architecture and Gothic architecture. An aerial's frame treats a window or a niche in a section of a wall as if it were a building, sometimes with columns or pilasters flanking the opening. Sometimes you would have seen a window which has two little columns on the side, which has a base, and on top of this column is a triangular pediment. Sometimes we see that occurring in most of the classical and neoclassical architecture. That is called an aerial. This style quickly spread to other Italian cities, and then to France, then to Germany, England, Russia and other places. Building off of these influences, the 17th century architects Inigo Jones and Sir Christopher Wren firmly established the classicist architecture in England. Let us talk about origin of neoclassicism. The architecture of neoclassicism seems to have emerged out of two different but related developments which radically transformed the relationship between man and nature. The first was a sudden increase in man's capacity to exercise control over nature, by which the mid-17th century had begun to advance beyond the technical frontiers of Renaissance. During the Renaissance age, there were a lot of developments which were made by many scientists, but even more developments came during the neoclassicist era, because like I mentioned earlier in the previous lecture, this was the age of enlightenment. And in the age of enlightenment, people started to make inventions, discoveries, and it was the age of revolutions. The industrial revolution started here. The steam engine was discovered, there were trains, there were tracks, there were machines to do things, the spinning jenny was invented. There were a lot of discoveries and inventions that happened in the middle of 17th century, which means there is an increased capacity of human being to exercise control over the nature. You had machines to do things, and a lot of things got influenced by this development. The second idea was a fundamental shift in the nature of human consciousness. In response to major changes taking place in society, which gave birth to a new cultural formation that was equally appropriate to the lifestyles of the declining aristocracy and the rising bourgeoisie. There was a shift in the nature of consciousness, because a lot of things were happening in the society because of the enlightenment and a lot of things going on parallelly. It gave birth to a new cultural context where people were thought of equals to each other. The aristocracy, the bourgeois, the rich people, previously it used to be the rich people who had all the class and who had all the resources and everything. Now a lot of people were becoming richer because thanks to the industrial revolution and thanks also to the change in mentality of people, where people were thought of, they had secular ideas, people had a lot of revolutionist ideas, and ideas were accepted and ideas were encouraged. Soon neoclassical architecture became an international style, because it spread from Italy to France, from France to Germany to England to Russia and to a lot of places. Although each country had some distinct character in their own style inside the neoclassicism, it was prevalent in France, Germany and England. The style was present throughout, almost throughout the European region, but locally the styles were little modified to suit their own purposes and their own ideologies. The neoclassicist architecture in England was a little different from France and Germany. The one in Russia was different from England and France. It happens because each and every region has different kinds of people and different minds working on the project, as well as different climatic conditions and different materials that are available in their locale. So that automatically happens in architecture, which also gives us a reinforcement to one more thing, which means they didn't just copy a particular style which got in, which was born in Italy. They didn't just copy neoclassicist style from one place and then copy it and put it in another. They kind of evolved the style to suit their own needs. So that is another big improvement in architecture, because previously people just used to copy things, and now copying, the idea was there, but they had to influence their own ideas, their own practical reasons, and modify it based on their requirement. So here is a look at neoclassical building, and take a look at the formal elements, the columns that support a pediment, grand entrance, windows accentuated on either sides by pilasters, cornices, sloped roof, chimneys, sometimes windows even exaggerated to look like little houses themselves. Here you can have a better look at what is happening. This is one part of the building which has a window, and this window is accentuated by two piers on either sides, and it has an arch, and the two piers have a pediment on top, which creates a meaning to itself. Circular windows, semicircular arches, these was very predominant in the neoclassical architecture. Look at the way they built steps. The entrances, the steps were mostly grand. They always ended in elements which is so grander in appearance. They had balconies and verandas, highly orderly. You can clearly, even if I erase out this particular portion of the building, you can clearly draw this portion by looking at this portion, because that is how orderly the building looks. That is the reason why we call it neoclassicism, because it is always derived from classicism. So look at the way building is symmetrically positioned, because even if I draw a line here and if I remove all this portion, we can clearly tell what's going to happen in here, because this is going to be an exact mirror image of this, or a little change perhaps here and there, but pretty much the mirror image of what is happening on one side will be the thing which is happening on the other side also. Here is another look at some of the sketches of neoclassicist buildings. You can see flat roofs lined by beams, orderly again, grand staircases, huge arches and columns, mirrors that are decorated with formal elements. You can have draperies, curtains, again formal ceiling here. Look at how orderly the whole thing is, and even the ornamentation which happens, the ornamentation is minimal when compared to Rococo and Baroque styles. Ornamentation is classical. If you look at this house, this building, it has a portico supported by 4 columns and a wall on the other side, has a pediment and tablature, and has everything, steps. This gives a grand entrance look to the house. Again, formal arrangement of windows, symmetrical, even the parapet, everything looks orderly and symmetrical. The architects of the 18th century searched for a new style. Their motivation was not simply to copy the ancient architecture, but to obey the principles on which their work had been based. In its purest form, It is a style principally derived from the architecture of classical Greece. Let us quickly look at some of the features of neoclassical architecture. Neoclassical or new classical architecture describes buildings that are inspired by the classical architecture of ancient Greece and Rome. These buildings are not copies of the buildings that were made during the classical architecture of ancient Greece and Rome, but buildings that are inspired by the classical architecture. A regular neoclassical building is likely to have one or more of these features which are listed on the screen right now. Symmetrical shape, tall columns that rise up to the full height of the building, triangular pediment, domed roof. Here we have symmetrical shape, tall columns that rise up to the full height of the building, triangular pediment, domed roof. Remember these four features, and I'm going to go back to the previous slide. So yes, what all do we have in this building? We have columns that go all the way to the roof. Yes. We have triangular pediments. Yes. We don't have a domed roof here. We don't know, because we don't know what is going on in the back area. We don't have a section of this building, and it for sure has a symmetrical shape, because if I draw a mirror on one side, it is exactly the same as the other side. So neoclassicist architecture has at least one or more of these things, which are columns that go up to the top of the building, tall columns, triangular pediments, domed roof, symmetrical shape. Take a look at these pictures here. Here you can see columns, and this is what is a pilaster. They have a column with inside the roof. This is what is a pilaster. They have columns and pilasters. Even if they don't have projection kind of a thing here, they still have a triangular pediment, and they are symmetrical. Again, symmetrical, triangular pediment, columns that go till the roof, long slender columns. So here you can see these features which keep repeating, and look at the ornamentation detail, how they have derived all these ornamentation details, simplified the classical elements, and they have tried to make this into a neoclassical building. Let us look at characteristics of neoclassical architecture quickly. Neoclassical buildings are characterized by clean, elegant lines and uncluttered appearances. Clean, elegant lines, uncluttered appearances. Do we see clean appearance, uncluttered? There is no clutter here, and we have very clean and very elegant lines that gives us a sense of nice and clean look, as opposed to the very cluttered appearance of the Baroque and Rococo styles. Previously in Baroque and Rococo, the lines used to be very cluttered because there used to be a lot of decor features on the building exterior itself. So compared to Baroque and Rococo, this is highly uncluttered. So in neoclassical architecture, orders are used structurally rather than as a form of decoration. This is a very, very important aspect, because classical orders means columns here. Columns are used structurally rather than as a form of decoration. Here if you see in these pictures, these columns, it has ionic order. These columns are not here for decoration. They are here because they are carrying this huge beam and the pediment and the roof of this room. So these columns are very, very structural columns. They are not decorative columns. As in the classical age, columns are freestanding, supporting entablatures. Columns are freestanding, as in columns are not supported by any other element like wall. They don't have a, it doesn't have a pier like appearance as they used to have in the medieval architecture. Columns are freestanding. They support entablatures. Entablatures are these elements. Roof lines are generally flat, horizontal, without towers and domes. Usually towers and domes kind of pit the elevation of any building in the medieval era. In any church, towers and domes were very, very important, because culturally people were able to relate it better, and in neoclassical architecture we don't have towers or we don't have domes. The roof lines are generally flat. Here again, if we see this building, look at the roof lines, flat, 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 flat. The facades tend to be long and flat. Even the facades of the building, they tend to be long, and again they are flat too. Even in other examples, the facades are long and again they are flat. We don't have circular, we don't have multi-shaped facades in this kind of architecture. There is a classical proportion maintained on the exterior of the building. If you see the picture here, there is a classical proportion which is maintained, which means the distance between these two columns is the same as this one. The proportion between the height of this column and the distance between these two columns is a certain proportion, and all the proportions are maintained properly, and above this arch will be the window, and number of arches here will be the same as number of windows, will be the same as number of smaller windows over here, and there is a certain order on the building, on the exterior of the building, and the decor is minimum on the exterior. If you look at the exterior of the building, the decor is minimum as against the Baroque and Rococo elements. Let's quickly look at neoclassical architecture in England. In England, where Rococo had never been fully accepted, the impulse to redeem the excess of Baroque found its first expression. Between 1750 and 1765, the major neoclassical proponents could be found in residences. England never had a famous Rococo style. It had Baroque, yes, but Rococo did not fully get immersed in the British culture, but whatever Baroque that was already there, it had to be out because the people have changed, people have evolved from Baroque to neoclassical architecture now. So, between 1750 and 1756, some of the houses started to become in commonplace, and there were three famous architects who explained, who were the key proponents of neoclassical architecture in England. They were James Stewart, George Dance, and Thomas Hope. James Stewart employed the Greek Doric order as early as 1758. George Dance designed the Newgate Gall in 1765, a superficially Pyrenean structure followed by neo-proportional Palladian theories of Robert Morris. Thomas Hope was more inclined towards the Greek revival. He designed a household furniture and interior decor based on Greek revival architecture in 1807. So, these three people were the key proponents of neoclassical architecture in England. And let us go into neoclassical architecture in France. Neoclassicism gained influence in Paris through a generation of French art students who were trained at the French Academy in Rome, as we studied earlier in the previous lecture. And we would look at the architects associated. The main person is Claude Perrat. Claude Perrat gave the concept of positive beauty and arbitrary beauty. Positive beauty is, he says, role of standardization and perfection. Arbitrary beauty is expressive function may be required by a particular circumstance or character. So, he gave his concept of positive beauty and arbitrary beauty. And there is another person called Abbé de Cordemoy. Abbé de Cordemoy challenged the Vitruvian principle, because the Vitruvian principle was like the Bible for all these architects. The utilitas, formitas and venustas. Utility, commodity, which is the utilitarian aspect of a particular object. Formitas, the structural integrity of a building, and venustas, beauty, Venus. The three trio was challenged by Abbé de Cordemoy. He says the first principle is correct positioning and proportioning of the classical orders is the first principle. Second principle is the correct disposition, appropriate disposition of the classical orders. Third is notion of fitness, which warned against the inappropriate application of classical elements to utilitarian or commercial structures. So, these three were his fundamental ideologies, wherein we will look at. First principle is correct proportioning of classical orders. Second principle is their appropriate disposition. Third principle is notion of fitness, which warned against the inappropriate application of classical elements to utilitarian or commercial structures. I look at another neoclassical architecture idea. It is Newton's Cenotaph created by Boole. There was another architect, Jacques-Germain Soufflot. Soufflot was a French architect in the international circle that introduced neoclassicism. His most famous work is the Pantheon in Paris. There is a Pantheon building in Paris, and he was the architect of Pantheon building. Building was originally a church dedicated to Saint Genevieve. He recreated the lightness, spaciousness and proportioning systems of classical Greek architecture. So, look at some of the neoclassical architecture which these people built. Soufflot, like all the architects of his day, considered the classical idiom essential. His famous principles were strictness of the line, firmness of form, simplicity of contour, and rigorously architectonic conception of detail. These were the principles by which Soufflot designed. So, in this lecture, we tried to understand the origin and evolution terminologies used in the concept of neoclassical architecture. We understood neoclassicist architecture in France and England. We also looked at some of the key proponents who propagated the architecture of neoclassicism in their respective countries. With the knowledge that you've had so far in this lecture, we should be able to answer these simple questions that are going to appear on the screen right now. Explain the importance of neoclassical architecture and its need, explaining the context. Who were the proponents of French neoclassical architecture? Explain their works. Who were the proponents of British neoclassical architecture? By explaining their works. What were the fundamental ordering principles of neoclassical architecture? With relevant sketches. I hope you understood the concept of neoclassical architecture so far, and I look forward to meeting you with more such lectures on the other side. Thank you.